Hey, this is Jimmy with Cascade Components. Today we are going to be doing the install and the bleed of the Cascade Components brake caliper. So if you take a look at our installation instructions, you will see a tool list. This includes all the tools you could possibly need. You might not need all the tools on this list. For this particular installation, we need a 5mm Allen wrench, a 4mm Allen wrench, a 2.5mm Allen wrench, and a T25 Torx bit, along with the usual cleaning materials for the bleeding process. So here we've got some rubbing alcohol and paper towels, and then there's the SRAM bleeding edge bleed kit. Along with that, you need .4 or 5.1 of your choice, as that is what is compatible with SRAM code brakes. All right, so we're gonna start off with pulling off the wheel. This isn't 100% necessary, but since sometimes brake fluid drips during the bleeding process, it's easier just to get it out of there so that your brake rotor is out of the way and won't get contaminated. Now we're gonna go and take the 5mm Allen, and we're going to unbolt the brake caliper. As you can see, there's actually access to this bottom bolt. Just slide those guys out of there. And then you can just let your caliper hang. Now, if you're using fresh pads, you don't need to do this. We're gonna be reusing the same pads. So we're gonna just go and pop the pads out. So pull the clip, then take the 2.5mm Allen wrench, then unthread the pin, slide your existing pads out. So it goes off to the side. All right, so we already have a prototype caliper installed on this bike, but the installation process it's the same for the prototype caliper to our production caliper versus with the code caliper to our caliper. So I'm gonna just ignore that for now. So this will be a little bit messy. Grab some paper towels to catch drips. On the back side here, there's the T25 for the banjo fitting. Crack that guy loose and unthread. Now again, brake line will drip, so just be ready for that. Slide that guy out. Cut most of the drips there. Set the old caliper off to the side. Then grab the new caliper, slide the banjo fitting in, and tighten. Now you don't have to tighten this all the way now. It'll seal without being entirely tight. If you leave it a little loose, you can adjust the angle of your banjo fitting. All right, so now that we got the banjo fitting on, we're gonna go and bolt the caliper back onto the bike. Again, leave these slightly loose so that you can get your caliper aligned with the brake rotor once it is all installed. Now, if you want to set this now, you can do it now or you can do it down the road. Doesn't really matter the order. I prefer to orient the banjo fitting first. Tighten that guy down. Now that we got that installed, we want to take the pin out. We already have the clip off of this one. Worth noting, with our caliper, the hardware uses a 3mm Allen wrench instead of a 2.5 for the pin. Just bigger Allen wrenches are nicer to work with. So slide that out. If you want to reuse the old pin, they're both compatible. It's essentially the same part, just different Allen wrench size. So this one's got the oil slick hardware, so we're gonna just reuse this because that is the colorway of this bike. All right, so now for the bleeding process. First off, you want the wheels off. The orientation of the caliper is very important for the bleeding of our brake caliper. So you're gonna wanna make sure that you just read through the bleeding instructions. They have a little diagram that depicts how you want your brake caliper oriented. This is important because the way the internal channels are designed, with it oriented like this so that the post mounts are perfectly vertical, all of the bubbles will flow to the top of the caliper. If it's not oriented perfectly vertical, you can get bubbles that get caught in a slight overhang. So be sure you have it completely vertical. Sometimes it helps to take the caliper off and rotate it around after the first bleed too to just shake bubbles free. Moving on to bleeding, just pull a little cover off there and break the bleeding edge bleed valve with the 4mm. Now we're gonna grab, this is a little out of order, but doesn't really matter. Take our bleed block, pop that in there. It is worth mentioning that if you are not familiar with bleeding your own brakes from a completely dry caliper, it might be worth your while just taking it to a shop. Having them do it, it's a little bit more involved than bleeding a caliper that already has brake fluid in it. But it's not that bad. We'll walk you through it. All right, so now we're gonna take our dot fluid. This isn't on the table because dot fluid's kind of gross. Just grab a little bit of fluid there. Make sure all the air is out of the syringe. Makes it a little easier to bleed. Clean that off so it's a little tidier. Pop that guy into the fitting. For the initial bleed, we're gonna focus on just getting the air out of the caliper body. This is going to mainly consist of pulling a vacuum and then pushing fluid in. And then we'll worry about getting it bled through to the top after most of the air is out of the caliper body. So open up the bleed valve all the way. We're just gonna give it a slight push. And then give it a pull. And the bubbles keep coming. Push again. Now see, this is why I filled the syringe up a fair bit right off the bat, because the calipers are completely dry. A fair bit of fluid will go into them. Pull again. Okay, so now we're getting to the point where not getting as many bubbles out of the caliper body. Close this really quick and give the brakes a little pump. Get stuff moving around. All right, so now we're gonna bleed the remainder of the caliper as you would with a standard SRAM brake. Level out the lever just to try and minimize drippage. Take your overly complicated screwdriver. Take your T10. A little bit of spillage there, so get the paper towel to mop that up and try not to make a mess. Set your little lever plug off to the side. Getting a little rubbing alcohol on the surfaces that brake fluid got on. Just try and stay ahead of the messes. Makes it a lot easier. All right, and this is the bleed syringe for the lever. Thread that one on there. Now, because there are going to be a few bubbles just in the lever assembly now, we're going to suck those out right off the bat. All right, so with the bottom cracked open, just gonna push fluid through the top. Be careful you don't accidentally push an air bubble in from the bottom, and then push the fluid from the top back all the way down. Then up again. And you kind of just cycle back and forth as needed until you don't see any bubbles on either side. All right, so now we're going to disconnect the top. Just need to unthread this. Here is a little trick with this. If you pull some fluid, this did not work well at all. Holy shit. Wow. Now we're gonna go and put the plug back in. Right, so now that we got the lever closed up, I'm just gonna clean that up really quick. Oh, I forgot to mention, while we were doing the bleed for the lever, make sure you have the contact adjust all the way in accordance to the SRAM bleed instructions. So for the initial bleed, there's no need to focus too much on getting the lever feel just right. There will probably still be some bubbles in there. This is more about just getting the majority of the bubbles out. Since we've got that first round done, we're just gonna get all the excess air out of this syringe. All right, so now that the initial bleed has been done, what we're gonna do is cycle the pistons just to help get any trapped bubbles out of there. So you want that closed, of course. There are a few different ways to do this. This is my kind of quick and dirty piston cycling method. Take your pads with the spring out, slide them in there, and put the pin through. Hold them in place. And then take the 4mm Allen wrench, slide it in between the pads and the piston body on one side. This will just let the pads function as a thing to hold back pistons on one side so that you can extend the pistons on one side and one side only. This usually is not this stubborn. I give it a little help. This is another way to extend your pistons. Just give it a bunch of pressure from the syringe. All right, so now that the pistons on that one side are fully extended, I'm just gonna pull the pads and the pin back out of there. And we're gonna push those pistons back out. There are a few ways to do it. We're just gonna use an Allen wrench and you hold it nice and even. There we go. And then we are going to repeat that on the opposite side. Drop the pads in there, move the pin again. All right. Got the piston cycled out on that side. Again, we're gonna pop out the pin and the pads. Set those back off to the side. And pull the pistons back in again. All right, now we're gonna take the lead block and slide that back on in. And then I'll pull some more bubbles out of there. So you can see cycling the pistons freed up quite a lot of bubbles. So this is a step of the bleed process that you're gonna wanna repeat until your brakes feel pretty reasonable. Since there's not a lot of space between the pistons and the caliper body, it's easy for bubbles to get trapped back there. If the brakes feel funny, it's likely because there's still bubbles trapped. So if you do the initial bleed, and you're like, this just doesn't feel right, just keep on trying until you don't get any bubbles. All right, so now we're gonna do the lever bleed again. Crack that open. So what I was trying to do last time, if you pull the fluid down into the bottom, then it will not try and spill out the top when you pull the plug out. So I'm just gonna push a little fluid in until that's level. Thread that onto the lever. Just plot any little bubbles that might be in there. And then again, I'm just gonna wanna cycle back and forth, so pushing fluid up from the bottom. Back down. Maybe a little bit less fluid than you would ideally have doing this, but that works. And again, be careful when you're pushing fluid through that you don't accidentally push a bubble through. Now we're gonna disconnect the top. Overflow. Just mop that up really quick. And then just gonna make sure the bottom's nice and firm. Jumped ahead a little bit here, you just disconnected the syringe from the caliper, closed that all off. Okay, so got the wheel back on, we've got the pads back in there, we've got the pin back in there. So now what we're doing is we are getting the pads centered. You want to squeeze the lever until it firms up to get the pads back in contact with the rotor. These are reasonably centered, so we're gonna call that good. Adjust your contact adjust to get your desired lever feel. We're gonna call that good enough for purpose of demonstration. Just feel about even. All right, so pop the plug plug back in, and the clip for the pin. So sometimes what'll happen here is you'll squeeze the lever a bunch, the pistons will extend unevenly. You can see they're actually a hair uneven on these. A little bit doesn't matter. If they're a little bit uneven, you pretty much just repeat the piston cycling procedure. So you pull your pin back out, pull the pads back out, push the pistons that are overextended back in, and essentially just keep going until they extend evenly. Again, if you're not familiar with this, find a knowledgeable bike shop. They will help you out. Having your brakes properly set up is hugely important. So now we're just gonna get the caliper centered on the rotor. This always sucks because as you tighten one, it moves the other. And it's stuck in this endless thing. All right, so now we have the caliper is centered on the rotor, spins nice and freely, stops on a dime. So a little note on compatibility with the brake calipers. If you take a look at the last page on our install and bleed instructions, it will have a list of post mount adapter compatibility, fork post mount compatibility, and frame post mount compatibility. To date, we are not aware of any frames or forks that are incompatible with the caliper. However, there are a few post mount adapters out there that are incompatible. This includes the SRAM 20 and 40 millimeter adapters. So if you're running SRAM brake adapters, there are other options out there. You just need to swap over to those. We've been using the Magura brake adapters on our bikes. Or this one right here happens to be a SRAM 40 millimeter brake adapter that someone maybe took a file to. So there you have it. That is the installation and bleed of the Cascade Components brake caliper. David needs to pump up his tires.